there it is, Frederick Turner. And Fred and I will be part of a group of poets and musicians performing this afternoon at 4:30, I assume downstairs where the folk singers were last night. We're going to have some folk music, some poetry, and we're also going to have one aria from the opera version of Ludlow that's in progress. If you don't mind, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this technological part of my talk as fast as I can so that I don't have to worry about it anymore, and then I can just talk about a few ideas and a few of the things I'm working on in an essay version of this, a longer essay version. So first of all, how many people here have heard of the Ludlow Massacre as an incident in American history? Just one person, or two. That's kind of typical, and it's even typical in Colorado. Although for the 100th anniversary of the Ludlow Massacre in 1914, the governor of Colorado did institute a certain set of a committee of people who worked on commemoration of the event. The event is something that's particularly important in American labor history, but from my own point of view, it's actually kind of a microcosm of modern American history altogether. It's really a fascinating moment. If you go into the cemeteries in southern Colorado, you will find the graves of people from almost every nationality and every racial background on the planet Earth. And a lot of Coloradans don't even know that. So what happens is that more than 20 different nationalities are working in the coal mines in southern Colorado. In 1913, the United Mine Workers, which is not a choir of angels, a pretty ruthless group of people, are infiltrating the workers, and between the kind of violent infiltration of the union and the excessive violence of the company owners who hired private detectives and made use of a local corrupt sheriff, etc. There's a lot of violence on both sides. And a lot of shooting starts happening in the fall of 1913. The governor calls out the National Guard. The National Guard tries to keep peace between the two sides for a few months, and then the state of Colorado finds itself unable to pay their salaries. They were bankrupt. Democratic governor named Ammons was a little bit weak-willed in the course of managing this whole event, although Woodrow Wilson, newly elected president, is watching it all in Washington. John D. Rockefeller Jr. is getting all the news in Manhattan. This is in the newspapers in New York and Chicago and everywhere in the United States. What's happening is this intense tension and violence between immigrants from more than 20 different nationalities and the established powers in southern Colorado. So you go into a train station in Pueblo, Colorado in 1912, you'll see a sign on the wall that says, "This waiting room is for Americans only, no Italians, no Mexicans, no Greeks." See the little distinction that's going on there? Racial hatred was part of it, ethnic hatred was part of it, economic paranoia was part of it, but you can also see that this is really indicative of a lot of different stages in American history. There's a kind of microcosm at work here. Corporate power is invested in maximizing profits out of the coal mines, and institutions like the 8-hour day don't exist. Fair pay in cash that you can spend anywhere, that doesn't exist. You're paid in company script that you can only spend in the company stores. No pay for doing the work that keeps you safe in the mines, what they call dead work. Doing all the buttressing and the building of supports in the mines, no pay for that. So if you want to keep yourself safe in the mines, it's all off your own back. And they were the most dangerous mines in the world at the time. And in one mine explosion in Dawson, northern New Mexico, October 1913, 263 miners were killed in one explosion, mostly young Italians. And their graves are visible there in Dawson. Under the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. There's the gist of it in a nutshell. In the spring, the militia is whittled down to 2 companies who are camped next to the striking miners. The racial hatred between them is intense. A lot of the militia folks had fought in Mexico and fought in the Philippines and had their own attitudes about dark-skinned people. That's a fact. On April 20th, right after the Greek Orthodox Easter, in which the Greek miners and the Cretan miners in the camp managed to steal a few sheep from local ranchers and celebrate the resurrection of Christ over the weekend. And a baseball game was played on Holy Sunday. The Monday morning after that, a pitched battle broke out, and in the course of the day, more than 20 people were killed. The camp was burned, and 13 women and children suffocated in a pit under one of the tents. So this became obviously big propaganda value for the Union, major part of American labor history, and something of great contention. Congressional hearings were held on this, Rockefeller was testifying, Union people were testifying, etc. So here's my connection to it. My grandfather, George Mason, was a businessman in Trinidad, Colorado, about 12 miles south of the massacre site. This is where my father grew up. This is a letter George wrote to somebody in Aguilar, a little town just north of the battle site. You can see George he'd started a creamery, and he used to make Mason's ice cream, and their ad said, "Mason's ice cream, better than the law requires." Because Mason's ice cream was made with 20% butter fat, you know? So anyway, they turned it into a candy company, and you can see purity and cleanliness, our hobby, right? Chocolates make friends, etc. But what George is writing to this man about is the mineral rights to a certain plot of land near Aguilar. He's interested in renting the land, investing in it, and I do not know the outcome of that business deal. That's 1911, 3 years before the massacre. This is a famous old photo of people in the strikers' camp, immigrants in the camp. The camp was huge, more than 1,000 people in that one camp at Ludlow, and there were a handful of camps in the region. Very sophisticated organization of people in the camp, etc. This is a bunch of people running the operation. This is a Union leader, John Lawson. I met a man in western Colorado who remembers sitting in John Lawson's lap when he was a little boy. And I said, what was his voice like? And he just said, deep, rough. This is Ilias Spandidakis, Louis Tikas, who was born in a little village called Loutra, near Rethymnon in Crete, and was 28 years old at the time of the Ludlow Massacre when the Colorado militia, he had just become an American citizen, Colorado militia shot him in the back that day and killed him. The monument at Ludlow is an interesting historical piece of information because it gets his age wrong. It says he was 30 years old, and a man named Zis Papanikolaos has done all the research and figured out that Louis was 28. That's a guy named Harlan, who later became mayor of Seattle. So you get some sense of how mobile people were in the West. There's the famous Irish rabble-rouser, Mother Jones. This is a guy named Horace Hawkins, who's a Union lawyer, and that's John Lawson over there. So what we have here is information, right? This is General John Chase, a Denver ophthalmologist who was in command of the units of the National Guard at the time of the massacre. That's him riding in on Main Street in Trinidad, and it may be just before this, which is a moment in which the militia made the absolutely stupid mistake of charging on horseback a bunch of striking miners who were protesting the incarceration of Mother Jones. General John Chase is said to have been so outraged by the strikers that when a young teenage striker taunted him, he reared up his horse, fell off his horse, and embarrassed himself in the street. Anyway, that's right in front of the post office in Trinidad. This is the aftermath of the massacre, or what one journalist calls a battle, because he points out that the militia troops may very well have set the fire, and most commentators and historians agree that they set the fire. That was one of their strategies for clearing the camps. But they wouldn't have known that women and children were in a pit underneath one of the tents, so it wasn't an intentional killing of women and children. Instead, they were, isn't that wonderful term, collateral damage? A bunch of soldiers horsing around after the massacre. Famous old photo of the aftermath. That's the death pit where the women and children were killed. And if you go to the Ludlow site, just north of Trinidad now, the Union maintains it. So the Union keeps its version of the story on display there. And you'll see little notebooks where people from all over the world know about this massacre. Greeks, Russians, etc. They all know about Ludlow. Americans don't know about it. That's the interesting thing. This is a guy named Frank Robino, who was killed in the massacre. There are autopsy photos of a lot of the victims. The children in a Catholic funeral procession. The funeral procession of Louis Ticas in Trinidad. And I'll tell you about an incident down there. This is Commercial Street. Right across the bridge before the strike, there was a shootout where a union guy named Gerald Lippiatt was killed. And I write about it from the point of view of a fictional character who lives on this side of the bridge, and she goes running over there to find out what's happening on the other side of the bridge. That's John Lawson as an old man. That's a photo of somebody nobody knows. This is a photographer who later photographed my father and his brothers in Trinidad. And in his archive, there's just an amazing array of photographs. This is an anonymous girl. Notice that he photographed the girl, and then he made a tiny print of it, pinned it to his easel, and photographed the photograph. So that's my emblem in my book of history, right? A photograph of a photograph of a photograph. Right? Where am I coming from? I'm coming from the fact that traditionally, the muse of history, Clio, and the muse of epic poetry have the same mother. Calliope and Clio have the same mother. Their mother is Mnemosyne, memory. Right? History and poetry were two of 9 sisters famous for their beautiful singing and their dancing. History was just as famous for singing beautifully as epic poetry, lyric poetry, music, dance, etc., right? So in their original conception, history and poetry are kind of equals. And I'm pointing out that it's actually historically a rather strange phenomenon, that particularly since the Renaissance and on to our age, they've become such separate ages. They become like a dysfunctional family, right? And there's a sibling rivalry between history and poetry. And we go back and forth in time where we place them hierarchically in different places. Sir Philip Sidney says, well, history is just hearsay, and he places it lower in the pecking order and places poetry at the top of all kinds of knowledge. Because among other things, poetry creates a kind of music that makes more difficult kinds of knowledge easier to absorb, etc. You know, that's a hierarchical notion. You get into our era, and I think most people would stick to their notion of factual truth and would place history higher on the pecking order, and poetry somewhat below it. Poetry being considered something that's entirely fictional. But I think, as we're beginning to see in multiple talks in this conference, degrees of fact and degrees of truth are often debatable, and we are talking about stories. Herodotus calls his histories researches or investigations, depending on how you translate the Greek. The modern Greek word, historias, is just story. That's all it means. And so I'm arguing that it behooves us, however we fall on this hierarchical scale, to remember that the two are related and that memory is imaginative. Hobbes says this in Leviathan, that memory and imagination are really two sides of the same thing. The only thing you need to know to demonstrate that really is just to remember your own family arguments and your version of it versus a sibling's version of it, right? You're going to understand that something happened over the dinner table that night, but your story of it and your sister's story of it or your brother's story of it are entirely different, or different in particulars, right? So we understand that memory and imagination are involved in fiction. Now, let me just really quickly I'll tell you what, I'll get to one excerpt from the book. In my essay, I'm referring to 2 nonfiction accounts of these events, one by Zeus Papanikolaou, who did the research on Louis Ticas, the other by a man named Scott Martel, who was a Los Angeles Times reporter and trained in journalistic expertise, where, among other things, you are supposed to have 3 sources for every fact you want to say is a fact, right? You need to triangulate your information and establish that we can say the weather was such and such on that day. We can say the sun rose at that at that time on that day, etc. So I'm just telling you about a shootout. I'll go back to the bridge. Oh, by the way, one more picture. That's the house in Crete where Louis Tikas was born. I visited there some years ago. And the Greeks know all about him because they've put a plaque up there about Tikas saying he was killed in Colorado in 1914. There's the bridge. So, Scott Martel, the journalist, writes his account of how Gerald Lippiatt arrives in Trinidad in August 1913, and he knows he's in trouble because he's a union organizer and the town is full of armed detectives who are usually beating up mine workers, abusing mine workers, and quite willing to kill any union man who's caught in town. So he's heading to the union office across that bridge there when he runs into a bunch of detectives, a guy named Belcher and some other folks. They start an argument, guns are drawn, Lippiatt goes down in a hail of bullets and manages to wound one of the detectives in the knee. And that's it. Those are the facts. Scott begins his book there, establishes that as the scene in which what you understand is that this intense hatred is breaking out in southern Colorado. And the sides are all heavily armed. Nobody's an angel. Nobody's innocent. And the people who are going to be led into this strike are going to be in serious trouble pretty soon because they're surrounded by armed people who have their own motives for doing what they're doing. I'm writing as a poet, and there's a Greek scholar who's written about my book, and he points out that one of the things I'm doing, and one of the things we can say Shakespeare does in his history plays, etc., is that we are imagining the inner lives of our characters. And in fact, we are making a tenable and believable inner life for our characters, which happens to be something that escapes the historical archive altogether, unless you can find certain kinds of evidence that suggest inner life, like letters, etc. So when I imagine my Louis Tikas, my historical character, I give him a pretty complex psychology that comes from my own knowledge of living among Greeks much of my life, speaking Greek, knowing a lot about Greek immigrants, etc. Having been to the places where he grew up, I imagine a life for this man. My fictional character has a mirror name, Luisa Mole. She's part Mexican, part Welsh. She's orphaned early in the book. Her father was a Welsh fireman meaning demolition man, dynamite man. Her mother died of fever in the camps, which is a common occurrence. Here, very, very quickly, and I'm going to end on this, is an excerpt in which that shootout is told from Luisa's point of view. Luisa's over here in a house. As it happens, the father of the family who have adopted her is a businessman whose business is up there a couple of blocks at the top of Commercial Street. His name is George Reed, and she has a girl's crush on George Reed. So the moment the shooting happens, her first thought is, he's over there, okay? After she put Pud down at his bedtime, Luisa sat on the steps to the front porch to catch the evening breeze. The girls were playing jump rope in the yard, and Mrs. Reed, her mending basket out, rocked and looked at the view of Fisher's Peak. The men worked late a summer Saturday. Luisa gazed across at town, the river. That was where they came from, pistol shots in quick succession. Pop, 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 pop. A ricochet of sound from buildings where Commercial Street fanned out above the river. What in tarnation? Mrs. Reed had stood. Pop, 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 pop. Luisa ran almost before she knew it, wind rushing past her ears, black hair flying. Behind her, voices screamed, "Luisa, no!" But no one followed as she crossed the thumping bridge. More people near, then running too, like her, both men and women. Then they were a crowd, and she stopped running. Motor cars and people jammed the street outside the union office. She saw the smashed glass of a shop window, the bullet holes and chips in the brick walls. A man lay on the street, holding his knee and cursing like a soldier. Another man lay twisted on a thick stream of his blood. Some women screamed. Policemen cleared a way to get an ambulance to the wounded man. Luisa stood, relieved it wasn't George. No, it was George Reed standing next to her. "What the hell are you doing here, young lady?" He'd put his collar on, his coat and tie with its cigar smells. Sometimes, walking home, he liked to smoke and maybe stop to drink just one with Arthur before he crossed the bridge. She felt him turn her from the sight and walk deliberately away, his hand upon her shoulder, steadying her shaking bones. Who was that man, she asked, the one who died? Some Union fella came in on the train. I heard him having words with 2 mine guards or detectives or whatever the hell they are. He stopped and turned her toward him, and she saw worry in his blue eyes. It's getting worse, young lady. More Union men arriving every week, more detectives. These fellas argued. I didn't see who started shooting. Now, my point in using that excerpt at the end is that Scott Martel and I agree absolutely on the facts of what happened that day. We agree on the weather, we agree on the time of the day, we agree on what happened, who got shot, etc. But my intention is different. My intention, and this is in blank verse, by the way, which is stolen from Shakespeare, among others. My intention is to give you some sense of the ground sense of these lives, what it is like to be a person in these circumstances. This happens to be a teenage girl a few months before the Ludlow Massacre. There's the start of what I've got to say, and we'll see if there's more to say about it after. Thanks a lot.